What is SOG? Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group was a highly classified, multi-service United States Special Operations Unit which conducted covert unconventional warfare operations prior to and during the Vietnam War. Established on 24 January 1964, the unit conducted strategic reconnaissance missions in the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Carried out the capture of enemy prisoners, rescued downed pilots, conducted rescue operations to retrieve prisoners of war throughout Southeast Asia, and conducted clandestine agent team activities and psychological operations. I am your host, Bruce Christensen. The history of SOG tells the stories of those who have fought valiantly to protect the liberty we hold most dear. The history of SOG has preserved and honors the legendary feats of our SOG soldiers. The history of SOG provides military history to today's soldiers, veterans of all conflicts, their families, and to the public at large. Our mission is to educate, inspire and engage our communities now and for generations to come. I have embarked on an adventure of epic proportion. I have designed a new website, the History of Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Within the contents of the site, I have documented all aspects of SOG from 1964 to 1972, including overall history of SOG, SOG chiefs, bases, mission, teams, virtual museum, individual stories, pictures, videos and so much more. There is also a store to promote SOG authors, books, and other SOG-related items. www.sogsite.com. My father Paul Christensen was assigned to SOG. Although he never talked about it, I did see his pictures and plaques. I knew he was a Green Beret, but not until my 30s did I find out what SOG was all about. The website, blogs and videos are dedicated to all the SOG warriors and the supporting units, such as the air assets, maritime operations, MiC forces and all of the indigenous troops assigned to SOG. One such warrior was In order to know Paul Christensen, you need to look into his past, a warrior dedicated to his country and the men he served with. At 15 years old, Paul ran away from home. He became a cowboy in the biggest ranch in Nevada. He then came home and said, "Hey, Mom, guess what? I joined the paratroopers. The army." He was just 16. This was during World War II. Paul's mother would protest, but the army chaplain ensured Mrs. Christensen that Paul was doing fine and he should stay as he would be surely drafted in 2 years. Paul joined the 11th Airborne Unit and was sent to Japan. This was 1946 and Paul was 16 years old. Japan was now occupied by the 7th Army under General MacArthur, Far East Command. Paul was assigned to various duties, including guarding Japanese prisoner Hideki Toho, the notorious Japanese warlord who had escalated World War II with China. He needed to be guarded as a war prisoner before the US hanged him. Paul would receive the World War II Victory Medal and Occupation of Japan Medal after the official ending of World War II. Paul was accepted to Officer Candidate School, Fort Campbell. With no formal education, Paul struggled to maintain a high GPA. Paul graduated November 21, 1950. First Lieutenant United States Army. Paul was off to Korea and was slotted for Airborne Unit. As things would have it, all the airborne units had too many officers, so he was assigned to the 7th Division 32nd Infantry. The 32nd seen its share of combat and paid heavy with the lives of good men. Paul was wounded twice while serving with the 32nd Infantry and received 2 Purple Hearts, but he wanted out of the infantry and back with an airborne unit. He submitted several requests, however this too was not to be, as Paul volunteered to become a forward aviation spotter. Paul and the plane's pilot would fly into the north and spot enemy positions and call in for ground and air strikes. This earned Paul the Air Medal and Paul got the bug to learn to fly. Everyone gets everything he wants. Paul wanted an airborne unit. Paul's request was granted, and he was assigned to the elite 82 40th Far East Command, UNPIK. This was the Special Forces of Korea. You might think of it like SOG, but during the Korean War. A classified unit. They trained partisans, did over-the-fence operations, downed pilot recovery and more. The UN partisan operations in Korea began more by chance than from planning. During the retreat in November-December 1950, thousands of anti-communist North Korean citizens were left behind to fend for themselves. Facing almost certain death at the hands of the communist invaders, these people fought their way to North Korea's west coast and sailed to offshore islands, where they prepared to fight a last-ditch battle. The US 8th Army eventually learned that friendly North Koreans still held the offshore islands. In January, the guerrilla section, 8th Army G3 Miscellaneous, came into being. A 6-man cadre code-named Leopard arrived on Penjeongdo, a large island off the North Korean-held west coast, and started the massive task of bringing partisan groups under 8th Army command. Leopard seaborne and interior operations started producing immediate results. Infiltration teams made contact with and supplied other partisan groups already operating within North Korea. Bridges were blown, roads and railroads interdicted, small North Korean and Chinese detachments wiped out, and a reliable agent network were established. Chinese and North Korean troops were diverted to badly needed frontline units to beef up security and anti-partisan operations. The strength of Leopard expanded daily until by June 1951. West Coast partisans counted more than 8,000 men. This made reorganization necessary and resulted in the formation of Wolf Pack. First on the island of Yeongpyeong-do and then Kangwon-do at the mouth of the Han River in the Yellow Sea. Excellent results were accomplished immediately. They compiled a record of successful raiding actions with a small loss record. A new section called Task Force Kirkland, later called Scannon, was formed to handle partisan operations on Korea's east coast. In May 1951, the guerrilla section became an independent army unit, the 8086th AU. This was subsequently changed to 82 40th Far East Command Liaison Detachment, FEC Leader D, and all partisan operations came under the guerrilla division, called UN Partisan Infantry Units, UNPIK, and then UN Partisan Forces Korea, UNPFK. Various missions were conducted north of the MLR and involved parachute drops, infiltration teams, and coastal raids. American troops comprised a cadre for all partisan units, providing training, radio communications, supplies, and also accompanying most of the operational missions for intelligence purposes. Liaison was coordinated with 8th Army, 9th Corps, US Navy, and CIA, in which the 82 40th Army Unit carried out rescue operations, search and destroy raids, and intelligence missions. In 1953, the partisans tied down over 200,000 enemy troops along the west coast to combat hit and run operations. Paul was assigned to Baker Company, Airborne Training Section. They wore no reserve parachutes. Paul would later be assigned to islands off the coast of North Korea. One person pointed out that he was furthest American north. From these islands, they could conduct raids into the north and assist in downed pilot recovery. In 1954, seeking more adventure, Paul relinquished his Army commission and joined the Air National Guard 188th FTR. Bomber Squad, pilot training 1st Lieutenant to Kirkland Air Base, New Mexico. Some have said, but never confirmed, Paul was being trained to fly so he could be dropped into North Korea to steal a MiG fighter. The younger pilots were awed at Paul's adventures in Korea. Paul, airborne, was the epitome during the Air Guard's physical training program. Because of hearing issues from 2 wounds he received in Korea, Paul would later give up this commission as well and rejoin the United States Army. Paul went to Vietnam, his first time with the 1st Special Forces Group, Green Berets, in 1962. In 1962, men of the SF were sent as advisors. The country was not as chaotic as the late 1960s and early 1970s. TDY tours were relatively good in the early 1960s. Paul's assignment was a medic, assisting the local population and SF personnel who needed attention. His best friend Gilbert C. Core, who was also a medic, was with Paul. They set up a medical clinic. Teeth and eye condition were the most concerning tasks with the Vietnamese adults. The other 1st Group personnel were training South Vietnamese troops, including the Mountain Commando School. Paul had many assignments while in Special Forces, but his 3 tours with SOG would prove to be the most rewarding. In 1965, Paul went back to Vietnam with SOG. He was assigned to S2 Intelligence and spent most of his time during his second tour in Saigon and his third and fourth with CCN at FOB 4 Da Nang and CCC FOB 2 Kon Tum. Hall had many brushes with death during his military career, but on this night death was all over. 16 SOG warriors were killed, the most in any Special Forces engagement in the history of Special Forces. This is the story was written by John S. Meyer, RT Idaho SOG. Marble Mountain was honeycombed with caves and trails. South along the China Sea, the beaches were flat. Abruptly, the two rugged peaks of Marble Mountain jutted up, and cradled between them was a pagoda, complete with monks who protested whenever US troops got too close to their holy temple but apparently didn't seem to mind having NVA or Viet Cong cadre around. In support of the conclusion that the NVA had infiltrated agents inside the camp is the fact that the NVA launched this attack when the number of soldiers within FOB 4 had swelled well beyond normal. There was an enlisted promotion board held the previous day, all of the FOB commanders, executive officers and their respective S3 and S2 officers held their monthly meetings earlier in the day that, in addition to the fact the population had grown when the CCN headquarters was recently moved from downtown Da Nang to FOB 4, thus making it FOB 4 CCN. By the time the NVA sappers hit the camp, there had to be at least twice, maybe 3 times as many Special Forces troops in the camp as were normally assigned, there recalls Watkins, who was in his second tour with SOG, at that time out of FOB 1. And had appeared before the promotion earlier in the day. The spirit earlier that fateful day was typical of any promotion board gathering, Watkins said. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of partying and general hell-raising by the Special Forces troops. With any promotion board, the drinking was usually heavy because many soldiers hadn't seen each other for extended periods of time, and at these gatherings, they tended to make up for the months apart during one day's heavy drinking. Inside without a shot. As America's elite partied into the night, NVA sappers quietly prepared for their attack. One company dressed in white loincloths, with white headbands and a piece of white material attached to their AKs. The last company wore red. The NVA troops began infiltrating through the thin wire in the southeast corner of the camp. For months, locals who worked at FOB 4 returned home through the wire. On that night, the NVA marched right into camp, heavily armed and carrying satchel charges. Sometime after 1 in the morning all hell broke loose, said former Green Beret Sergeant Ronald D. Red Podlasky. At first, I thought we were taking incoming. What many thought were incoming rounds were satchel charges exploding throughout the compound. One company attacked the American recon huts which sat in 3 north-south rows on the eastern side of the camp. Another company of NVA hit the TOC, destroying it and damaging the commo center. Other sappers hit the officers' quarters and transient barracks at the northwestern quadrant. Podlasky was a team leader in recon company at FOB 4 CCN. The NVA sappers with satchel charges went up to the front door and threw charges into each plywood hut, which housed 2 to 6 Green Berets. A medic who was staying with Podlasky that night later recounted. We were lucky. The front door on our hooch had an extra strong spring on it, so that the door was hard to open. When the sappers came to our hooch, they pulled open the door and threw the satchel charge. But the spring was so strong, the door closed so quickly that the charges bounced off the door and blew up the front steps. There was so much confusion and pandemonium the medic and Podlasky didn't realize what had happened outside. Hell, when we ran outside we didn't realize the steps had been blown away, so we fell ass over head, Podlasky recalls. As Podlasky and the medic fell, an NVA sapper opened fire on full automatic, shooting high. He fired where he thought we were going to be running. If we hadn't fallen, he probably would have gotten us. Running recon and CCN we had plenty of close calls in the field, said Podlasky, who ran more than a dozen targets in Laos and Cambodia during his tour with SOG. But I remember hitting his sand and disbelieving that the closest call of all for M was right there in camp, in CCN, when that sapper opened up on us. Unbelievable. The South Vietnamese CCN recon team member killed the sapper as the indigenous troops rallied from their quarters. Watkins was asleep in the BOQ along the northern quadrant of the camp because the transient billets were packed with people who had gone before the promotion board earlier in the day. Like Podlasky, Watkins and several of the officers were awakened by the explosions, Watkins said. Thought we were taking incoming at first. Then, I realized we weren't taking incoming, and simultaneously, I regretted having given my Swedish K to a friend that night. All I had was my old Colt .45, which was in my flight survival vest. The NVA had knocked the air conditioners out of the wall and pushed several satchel charges into the building through the holes. As Watkins crawled down the hallway, several explosions ripped through the building. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief as he saw 2 officers looking out a nearby window. I told the officers to get down on the floor or they weren't long for this world. By then men in the camp began to put up flares, lighting the camp-turned-battlefield. At some point, an AC-130 Spectre gunship with 4 miniguns and 2 20 Mike cannons arrived over CCN. Spectre did a hell of a job, Watkins said. They dropped flares and caught some NVA in the wire, plus they were able to hit a couple of pockets of NVA in the camp. All who had been out drinking with his fellow Green Berets that night returned to his NCO barracks. He was asleep when he was blown off his bed when an NVA sapper threw in a satchel charge. Dazed and confused, Paul managed to get to his feet, however everything in his room was in a rubble pile. Paul could not find his weapon, but charged outside anyways. All hell was breaking loose. While he was assessing the area he seen a wounded Green Beret. Paul also noticed someone driving a jeep picking up the wounded. Paul picked up the wounded soldier and ran through a hail of bullet fire and put the wounded man on the jeep. Not knowing he was grazed by a round, NVA or friendly, hard to tell. All and an Indig soldier were able to get to some weapon and carry the fight to the NVA. Within the CCN compound, a young Vietnamese boy lived. SOG personnel called him Spike. Spike was the mascot of the camp. He was dressed in GI uniforms and lived among the men. The next morning after the attack, while going through the burned-out rubble, Spike came across this FOB4 plaque. He walked up to Paul, and with sadness in his eyes, shaking his head gave it to Paul. The holes in the plaque are from AK-47 or CAR-15 as well as bomb fragmentation. The burn marks are from the fires that erupted after the explosions. Paul wrote Gilbert C. Core on the plaque. Gilbert was killed in the attack. Gilbert and Paul spent TTY in 1962-63 together in the early days of Vietnam. Both medics during that tour, they were best of friends. Paul's injuries would heal, and he received his 3rd Purple Heart. However, this would not be his last. Paul was reassigned to FOB2 in the S2 shack. This was in 1969. During his stay there, his sleeping quarters was hit by an NVA rocket. Luckily, the rocket exploded outward and not into the hooch where Paul was sleeping. Paul was convinced they were after him. After his stay in a hospital ship recovering from his injuries, 4th Purple Heart, Paul's tour was almost over. He was sent to Not Rank 4 out processing. It was from this location that Special Forces teams and team members would be dispatched to all parts of the country and Special Forces personnel were out processed. There he spent some time on the beach, miniature golf, spent time with old friends, and had his share of ice cream. The command at 5th Group went out of the way to provide a taste of home. When there was time, you could have an ice cream cone for 10 cents, a sundae for 30 cents, or a banana split for 55 cents. From 1946 to 1969 Paul served this great country of ours. His story is like the story of thousands of brave men who fought in battles and wars. It is nothing new, as men have done it since the beginning of time, and will continue to do it long after all of us are long gone. However, this American hero is different. This soldier, airborne paratrooper, 82 40th Commando, Air National Guard pilot, Special Forces medic and MACV-SOG warrior is my father.